And for that, we have a speaker today, Caskie. He's going to speak to us about SS Great Britain. You might have seen little hints of it on the screen. It's going to be fascinating. People will decide to like. So please give a warm welcome and encouragement to Ian Caskie, Mr. Caskie.
So I just hope that you can hear me okay. Right, it's lovely to be back up here in Shropshire, and I've got family in Much Wenlock who I stay with when I come this way from Bristol, and it's always terrific to come to your lovely county. Just a little bit of background about myself so you know why I'm equipped to talk about this fabulous ship. I was born and bred on Merseyside. My dad was a shipping manager, worked in the Liver building in Liverpool. I spent my childhood down there on the end of New Brighton Pier, watching the liners leave the pier head, and that gave me a lifelong love of ships, which clearly I've had ever since. And although I didn't go into the Navy, my career was actually in education. I was a head teacher in Bristol for many, many years before working for the local authority, and then I retired a few years ago so that I could do more and more of this. I go all over the country on behalf of the Trust. I've been up to the Lake District and Hull. I've spoken at the National Maritime Museum down in Falmouth, and I feel as if I'm doing missionary work on behalf of the Trust. I'm spreading the word about this fabulous ship, and I'm hoping that my gallop through its history this morning will maybe encourage you to visit if you haven't already done so, perhaps in recent times. Before we start, though, I'm guessing you can hear me, even in the cheap seats. You okay at the back?
Yeah.
Good. The other worry we've got this morning are these pillars. Organise yourself so you can see the screen. That's the important thing to see. You don't need to see my ugly mug. So if I'm behind the pillar, don't panic. The screen's important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the history of the ship for about 45-50 minutes, unless I see the majority of you nodding off. I might have to cut it short, but I'm hoping there will be time for questions at the end. So I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have, subject to Vivian saying we've got time, but please don't make them too difficult. Okay, that's the only proviso. So anyway, you can see the titles from launch to relaunch. Don't think for 1 minute that the ship is actually back in the water. She sort of is, but when I get to the part about the condition she's in at the moment, you'll realise that very sadly there's no chance of her being afloat again, unfortunately, but we've done our best to make it look like she is. So here we go. SS Great Britain from launch to relaunch. Now don't panic, I have not brought the wrong PowerPoint. I know it's a picture of a train, but what I wanted to do is to set this whole story in historical context. The story begins in the 1830s, so this is post-industrial revolution, so the invention of the steam engine has already had a profound impact on the way that people travel on land, both on land and sea. Now here we are with the early steam locomotion transforming land travel. And at the same time, they were starting to develop paddle steamers to work particularly in land and coastal waters. And it was within this context that a lucrative contract came up for grabs. Now, does anyone recognise the chap in the top right-hand corner? I can tell you it's not Brunel. I can't hear anyone giving the right answer. I'll give you a clue. 3 of his line's wonderful ships met on the Mersey last year to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the Britannia, which is the stamp in the top left, their first voyage from Liverpool. It's Samuel Cunard. And the lucrative contract that came up for grabs was to carry the Royal Mail between this country and America. And Cunard decided to tender for this by building 4 200-foot wooden paddle steamers. The Britannia was the first. She had 3 sister ships. Now, it was decided that a rival company would be established in Bristol, and that was the Great Western Steamship Company. And they were going to go head-to-head with Cunard in the hope of securing the contract. And they made a rather courageous decision. by appointing this chap as the chief engineer. Now, I'm sure you all recognise IKB. I say it was a courageous decision because at the time of his appointment, he'd never built a ship in his life. He was appointed really on the success of the Great Western Railway. And in Brunel, they recognised a creative, free-thinking, charismatic engineer, hugely talented, who would deliver what they wanted. And what they wanted was 4 200-foot wooden paddle steamers to match Cunard. Now, as you probably are aware, Brunel's not one, or wasn't one, for sticking to a script. And certainly, he went way off tack, and there's a good reason for that. He was a real visionary, and I put Richard Branson up there because in many, many ways I think that Brunel's vision for the company was somewhat Branson-esque. He said to the company directors, I want people to travel Brunel, London to New York. The idea being that they'd get on his train at Paddington in London, steam down to Bristol, stay overnight in his Great Western Hotel before boarding his steamer for New York the next morning. An incredibly forward-thinking idea. It's still in the 1830s here, so it's quite remarkable. But as I say, it didn't quite go to plan. He did deliver the first of those proposed 4 ships, though. This is the Great Western. She was built and launched in Bristol in the late 1830s for the transatlantic run and was a successful ship in her own right. He eventually built 3 ships in his lifetime, only 2 for the Great Western Steamship Company. You may have heard of the third one. This is the Great Eastern. This was the colossal ship that was built in London, and unfortunately she was somewhat of a failure. Her only real claim to fame was that she was the ship that laid the transatlantic telegraph cable. But she was the biggest ship in the world for over 40 years, before finishing her days on the River Mersey and sadly just anchored there and used as an advertising boarding before being broken up. But it was the second of those 3 ships that was going to change shipbuilding forever. And it was because that in building her, Brunel resolved 2 emerging and conflicting technologies. Now at the time, this is post-Napoleonic Wars, so timber was in relatively short supply and very expensive. But of course it was the traditional material for building a ship's hull. But Brunel realised the limitations in using wood. He was bringing a fresh pair of eyes to shipbuilding. Now, the problem with wood was that you can only really build up to about 200 feet. Longer than that, it just becomes too flexible and it's just not viable. But also, because of the amount of internal bracing you need and the density of timber required to build a strong hull, it makes the hull very, very heavy, which slows the ship down, and also limits the space inside the ship for lucrative passenger and cargo. And so he went to the company directors, having seen a small craft come into Bristol called the Rainbow. Now, she had an iron hull, and he was fascinated by this because he saw the fact that with iron you can build a much bigger ship, you can build a strong hull which is very thin, but there's masses of space inside, so your profit margins rapidly increase. And he said to the company directors, you know that second 200-foot wooden paddle steamer you wanted? I propose we go for over 300 feet long with an iron hull. We'll make more money. And surprisingly, the company directors didn't turn around and say to Brunel, you crackers, go back to what we asked you to do. They backed him. And so he started designing this colossal ship in the dock in Bristol. But she was still going to be a paddle steamer, because that was the known technology. But then, at the early design stage, a further craft came into Bristol called the Archimedes. Now, she was trialing a prototype propeller, and Brunel once again recognised a limitation in using paddle wheels. The problem with them was that once the ship hits the open ocean and starts to roll, one of the paddle wheels is constantly out of the water in heavy seas, not only burning up fuel unnecessarily, but causing the ship to zigzag. Brunel was a great one for taking emerging technologies and applying them way beyond people's imaginations. And after a lot of trials with propellers, he decided to go back to the directors and say, forget a paddle steamer, I want to use a propeller. Now, nobody had ever put one on an ocean-going ship with an iron hull before, but Brunel persuaded them that this was the way to go. Much more efficient, and she would be much faster. And again, they backed him. And so, in one fell swoop, Brunel created the biggest ship in the world, the fastest ship in the world, the first ocean-going ship with an iron hull driven by a propeller, the first transatlantic liner. No wonder she's called the forefather of all modern ships. And you've got to remember that this is just 38 years after Trafalgar. What an astonishing leap forward. It's almost as if he designed a cross between Concorde and a jumbo jet for the Victorian age. And certainly shipbuilding was never ever the same again. And there she is in her original guise, a beautiful looking ship, 6-masted, schooner rigged, and certainly when she emerged from her dry dock in Bristol, she was a sight to behold. Now the launch, as you can imagine, was a tremendous occasion for the city. We're now at 1843, she'd been built in about 3.5 years, and the guest of honour was to be Prince Albert, Victoria's consort. And you'll notice from this ticket that as a major bonus, he was going to turn up alive. I'm so pleased you laughed at that. It's very encouraging if you laugh in the right places. The idea was that he steamed down to Bristol on the Great Western Railway. There was a banquet held, and then the very next day he took his place with all the other dignitaries in this special pavilion by the side of the ship, and you can see the crowds that had turned out in their thousands to see this monstrous ship emerge from the dry dock. Now, you're probably aware that it's traditional that when a ship is launched, a bottle of champagne is crashed against the bow. And the honour of doing this was given to one of the wives of the company directors. I have to be quite careful when I'm speaking to women's institutes when I say this bit, but bearing in mind this ship is over 300 feet long, somehow she contrived to miss the ship. Fortunately, there was a further bottle handy which Prince Albert grabbed and hurled at the ship from some 20 feet away. It crashed on the side, so almost by accident he played a very prominent role in her floating out. And of course she came out to great acclaim, and Brunel must have felt pretty pleased with himself. He always called the ship his masterpiece, and he must have been feeling very, very pleased indeed. But unfortunately that bubble was about to be burst. And it was due to this. Now, those of you familiar with the geography of the Bristol Harbour, the docks were in the city centre at the time, and the harbour is linked to the River Avon through a series of locks. And the Bristol Dock Company had said that they would widen this south entrance lock to the river so that the ship could pass safely through. But at the time of her floating out, work on this south entrance lock hadn't even started, and she was trapped in Bristol for over a year. You can imagine the fury amongst the directors about the lost profits, and Brunel, well, goodness only knows what he was muttering to himself. He must have been absolutely furious, because in his moment of triumph, there he was frustrated by this nonsense. But eventually, the dock company said that they had widened the lock sufficiently, and sure enough, she passed safely through the junction lock, but then jammed in this entrance lock with the river. They hadn't sufficiently widened it, so the ship had to be reversed back out, and Brunel was so worried about missing a particularly high tide to get her safely down the river that he took a gang of navvies down at midnight, and they stripped all the coping stones off the side of the lock, and she squeezed through with inches to spare. And as it turned out, that was the last Bristol was to see of the ship until her eventual return in 1970. She always used Liverpool as a home port. But there she is, at long last, able to undertake her sea trials, and they went very successfully, and she made her way up to Liverpool to commence on her maiden voyage after that very unfortunate delay. Now, she was actually built for 250 first and second class passengers, but only 45 bought a ticket on that maiden voyage. It's thought that there was a lot of doubt about the safety of the ship because, of course, to a lay person, wood floats and iron does the other thing, and they wanted to make sure that this ship was going to make it safely to America before committing to buying a passage. And, of course, she did make it safely across. She made the crossing in 15 days, and the propeller proved to be very, very efficient. It was able to drive the ship forward up to 12 knots, and they were very, very pleased indeed. And in fact, here's the replica of that original propeller in our dry dock, the original six-bladed one. And they've done computer tests on the design of that propeller and found it to be 92% efficient, which is astounding given the fact that it was the very first time one had been used like this. Very efficient, but unfortunately somewhat fragile. On her fourth crossing, coming back from New York, she eventually reached Liverpool with just one of the 6 blades left. The other 5 had snapped off, and she had to come a considerable distance under sail. So in an immediate refit, they fitted a stronger 4-bladed propeller. And it was on the very next voyage, the 5th voyage, that she ran into trouble. Now, the route to America in those days was to sail south of the Isle of Man, then turn north between the Isle of Man and Ireland, and then go around the north coast of Ireland and head out across the North Atlantic. But on this 5th voyage, they left Liverpool on a very foggy night. For some reason, they missed the Calf of Man light, continued west, and ended up washed up on Dundrum Bay Beach on the west coast of Northern Ireland, narrowly missing some rocks. And it must have been absolutely terrifying for the passengers on board. She was about 2/3 full, and we know from this passenger entry that the sea broke over the ship, the waves struck her like thunderclaps, the gravel grated below. There was the throwing overboard of coals, the cries of children, the groans of women, blue light signal guns, even the tears of men, and amidst all rose the voice of prayer. And they took them off the ship the next morning, got them off the beach in seaweed carts, and they had to find their way back to Liverpool to seek an alternative passage. But the ship was well and truly stuck there, and Brunel travelled over to see what damage had been sustained, and he wrote back to the company, "The finest ship in the world is lying like a useless saucepan, kicking about on the most exposed shore that you can imagine." And he was very, very concerned about the forthcoming winter, that the storms might well cause her to break up, and certainly a less strong ship may well have been the end of her. So what he did was he designed this sort of breakwater effect around the stern of the ship using some timber. And the idea of that was that that would reduce the power of the waves crashing against her sufficiently so that she would survive and hopefully be floated off on the spring tide. And it worked absolutely fabulously so that they were able to start salvaging her the following year. Now, I don't know whether any of you saw any footage or photographs of how they righted the Costa Concordia, but here we are in 1847 using exactly the same idea. They used concrete with the Costa Concordia, but here we have wooden crates filled with sand and gravel on one side of the ship. The idea being that this additional weight would pull the ship up onto an even keel so that she could then be floated off. And the salvage operation was a great success, and she found her way back to Liverpool. But unfortunately, it had proven to be so expensive that it bankrupted the Great Western Steamship Company, and they had to sell off the Great Western and the Great Britain just to clear their debts. So that you could argue that actually as a transatlantic liner, the Great Britain had been an economic failure. And if that was the end of the story, you'd be getting your cups of coffee a lot earlier. But unfortunately, I've got more to tell you. Because in 1850, when she was back in Liverpool, something happened on the other side of the world that was going to give her a new lease of life, which proved to be the most successful period of her working career. And that was gold was discovered in Australia. Now suddenly there was a huge demand by people wanting to emigrate and start a new life down under. And of course they needed the ships capable of taking them. And it was Gibbs Bright Company who saw the potential of Great Britain as an emigrant ship. And so they bought her and in a significant refit converted her to a square-rigged sailing ship with auxiliary engines. The idea being that she would sail non-stop between Liverpool and Melbourne using the trade winds, only firing the engines when they needed to, and then continue right the way around the world to use the favourable winds. And she was ready to start on this run by 1852. Now, by now, she was equipped to carry over 700 passengers, but it wasn't cheap. A first-class ticket on the Great Britain during this time would cost you in today's money about £5,000. But even in steerage, which had been added for the very first time, a steerage ticket would cost about £1,500. So this is people possibly selling up everything and taking that risk and gamble that Australia would provide them with a better life. A massively courageous thing to do. I mean, they couldn't Google Earth Melbourne and check it out in advance. This must have been like going to the moon. But they did, and we know they went in their thousands. And it was during this time, as I say, that Great Britain became a very, very popular and successful ship. The main reason was that she was so reliable, but also very fast and luxurious. She was clipping weeks off the traditional sailing times. She was getting to Melbourne in round about 2 months, and so very, very popular indeed. What they did find, though, was on these voyages to Australia, when the engines weren't fired, the propeller would slow the ship down by causing drag. And so in an 1857 refit, they fitted a two-bladed propeller within a lifting cradle, so that when not in use, it could be disconnected from the prop shaft and raised up into the stern of the ship like an outboard motor. Incredible technology for the time. And if you visit our museum, you can actually operate the mechanism in the original lifting cradle and raise the propeller for yourself. Now, this is an aspect of travel on the ship that's often overlooked. They took a vast number of live animals with them to provide fresh meat and eggs and milk for the journey. And on one voyage in 1860, they took 38 pigs, 2 bullocks, a dairy cow, 30 turkeys, 133 sheep, 400 geese, 420 chickens, and 300 ducks. And obviously those numbers would decrease the closer you got to Melbourne, once the ship's butcher got his hands on them. But even so, it's a remarkable thought that the top deck must have resembled a farmyard. And we know that crew were given special duties to keep the animals fed and watered and so on. So quite something. In the 1850s, she was requisitioned to travel to Crimea, carrying troops to the war. And this is a contemporary watercolour sketch by one of the soldiers going out there. She mainly ferried them around the Mediterranean. Also, in 1861, she took the first All-England cricket team out to Australia. Very first time a cricket team left England, they went on to Great Britain. It's not Brunel in the top hat, he was dead by now, but they were a successful team. Their first game actually was against the so-called Melbourne 11, yes. But in fact, when they started the game, it was realised that the Australians had actually fielded 16 players. But the England team still beat them, so we got off to a good start. Lots of rules and regulations on board, as you can imagine, to keep people in order, and I've just picked out these two to give you a flavour of what they were like. The first one, any person being drunk and disorderly shall have his name given to the barman, who's to supply him with nothing more for the remainder of the voyage. Just imagine if that was your first evening. 2 months without a drink. And also, gambling is strictly prohibited and card playing on Sundays will not be permitted, on which days divine service will be performed, weather permitting. So it must have been up on the top deck, presumably round the animals or something. I guess that would be quite handy if they were doing a nativity scene. But it was, interestingly, it was the only time that the different class of passengers would actually come together. There was a strict segregation by class, but they all met when it came to divine service. Now, 2 months cooped up in this ship must have been pretty boring, and we know from passenger diaries that a lot would pass the time by playing board games like backgammon and chess and drafts. The talented members of the passenger list would entertain the others by providing recitals and so on. And they even occasionally put together a very interesting publication called the Great Britain Times, which has been a hugely valuable resource to the Trust in piecing together what life was like on the ship during this time. I mentioned the segregation by class, so you could only go into parts of the ship if your ticket allowed, but interestingly on the Great Britain, you were also segregated by gender. They put the single men in the bow, single women in the stern, the midships was reserved for married couples and family groups. They kept the single people as far away as possible from one another. They didn't want any hanky-panky on the Great Britain, thank you very much. But I found this wonderful diary entry which clearly demonstrates that some people got around this. And it concerns a certain Mrs. Hodgson. All the ladies have cut her, that she took up very familiarly with a very shady man. She's decidedly the fast one on board, and has obtained the name of Lively Woman amongst the sailors. So clearly 2 months of backgammon wasn't enough excitement for Mrs. Hodgson, so hats off to her. Food was a real highlight of the day. It wasn't bad in steerage, but in first class it really was something else. And we know from the honeymoon diary of Mary Crompton that, as she says, I never saw such a place as this for eating. People seem to do very little else. It's a bit like cruising today, isn't it? We had breakfast at 9, lunch at 12, dinner at 4, and tea at 7:30. Now just listen to this for a breakfast menu. Our breakfasts are wonderful. Hot beef steak, mutton chops, boiled salt fish, herrings, potted anchovies, cold ham, tongue beef, boiled eggs and bacon, cold boiled fowl, hot rolls, tea, coffee and toast. And you got lunch at 12 o'clock. So this really was luxurious living on the high seas, and that's why the ship was so popular. But of course, hand in hand with all this wonderful food went seasickness, and she was a real roller in her time, and many a passenger diary is full of people feeling very unwell. Now those of you who have visited the ship will know that we like to give our visitors a multi-sensory experience. And we're not content for you just to enjoy the sights and sounds, we like to give you the smells as well. And if they've just topped up the chemical reservoir by this poor maid's cabin, it can be pretty ripe, because as you can see she's being unwell into a bowl. And also you may recognise a little visitor on the top bunk. There's a rat up there, and I'll tell you about those in a minute. So you had seasickness to put up with. You also had extremes of temperature as well, because of course the ship was sailing from our temperate latitudes down across the equator, where it would have been stiflingly hot, and then down into the southern oceans, where they could even contend with icebergs. So a huge temperature range. And we know from this passenger diary that the equator really was very unpleasant. The fierce sun has made the iron receptacle which contained us one enormous oven, in which we poor devils are baking, sweltering and sweating all day and night. And if that wasn't enough, we had these chaps as well. And they didn't stick to parts of the ship like passengers had to. They went everywhere. And in first class, we're beginning to see the rats. One came into my cabin the other night as I was going to bed. I jumped onto the berth. Mrs. Fenwick was wakened by one biting her toenails. Can you imagine? So lots of things to contend with. Now this gentleman is John Gray. He was the longest serving captain of the ship, very, very popular with both crew and passengers. But he met a rather mysterious end, which has never really been resolved. The ship was sailing back to Liverpool in 1871, and one morning the crew could not find the captain anywhere. They searched the ship from bow to stern, and all they found was one of the stern ports had been unlocked and was left open. And they concluded that the captain must have jumped overboard and committed suicide during the night. And on reflection, they felt that he had been somewhat depressed for several weeks. And the tragedy of all this was that the ship was ready to berth at Liverpool on Christmas morning. And there on the dockside to welcome the ship home was the captain's wife and 4 daughters. And so when the ship was alongside, the officers had to break the tragic news to them. And to this very day, nobody really knows what happened. And in fact, it's said that his ghost still haunts the ship. We've even had that television programme, Britain's Most Haunted, down to the ship, and they spent a night filming. They didn't find anything, but it's just one of those rather interesting stories associated with the ship. Now, by the late 1870s, demand for passage to Australia was beginning to tail off. And so the ship was put up for auction. But by then, she'd been around the world over 30 times, doing over 1 million miles, and had taken over 16,000 emigrants to Australia. So many families can track back through their history to that original voyage. And so she was put up for auction, sat there up on the Mersey for a few years, before an associate company, Anthony Gibbs, realised that the ship would make a really good cargo ship, because by now the Americans were extending their railroads towards the west coast and were importing high-grade coal. And so Anthony Gibbs bought the ship for a very, very small sum, basically removed all the engines and all the passenger accommodation so that she could carry as much coal as possible, and she was now a 3-masted windjammer. So she'd gone completely backwards technologically. She started life as a steamship with auxiliary sails, then went to a sailing ship with auxiliary engines, and now she's a sailing ship. Quite interesting, counterintuitive, you might say. And you possibly think from that photograph that the iron hull is now made of wood. Well, in fact, having stripped out the interior of the ship, they were concerned that that might weaken her. So they had the top sides clad in pine. Now we think it probably was unnecessary, but as it's turned out, it was incredibly helpful in terms of the long-term preservation of the ship, as we will see. Now she was ready to start work carrying Welsh coal out of Penarth in 1882. And she completed 2 round trips to San Francisco around Cape Horn, carrying Welsh coal, but unfortunately on the 3rd trip out in 1886, disaster struck. She was just rounding Cape Horn and got caught in a terrific storm, suffered some damage, particularly to her rigging, and put back to the Falkland Islands, hopefully to be repaired. But when they got to Port Stanley, they realised that the repair costs were more than the ship was worth, and so she was sold off to the Falkland Island Company for just £2,000, and for many, many years, the islanders anchored her outside Port Stanley Harbour and used her as a floating warehouse to store coal and wool and grain for the islanders. And she was used like that for many, many years, but by the 1930s, her decks were rotting. They didn't really need her as that storage facility anymore, and so in 1937 they took a very sad decision to tow her across to Sparrow Cove, beach her at low tide, bash holes in the stern and the belly of the ship so she'd take on water, and having scuttled her, she was abandoned, the idea being that over time the South Atlantic would finish her off. A very sad end, you might think, to one of the most important ships ever built. And that's where she languished for many, many years. During these sad days, though, she did play a small part in the Second World War. The ship in the top picture there is HMS Exeter. Now, Exeter was part of the fleet that went after the Admiral Graf Spee, the famous German pocket battleship. And in the Battle of the River Plate, Exeter was damaged, and it said that they took 2 or 3 plates off the Great Britain's hull to patch the Exeter up so that she could make it safely to port and then be properly repaired and returned to active service. But otherwise, during these days, the only people that really enjoyed the ship were the island children. Now, they used to love to row out to her and use her as an adventure playground. Just imagine what the health and safety executive would say about that. But there's many a diary entry saying they had a fabulous time on board, and then they picked these huge mussels that grew on the ship's hull and row home and have them cooked for their tea. And it's said for many years, Great Britain mussels were a real delicacy of the islands. But it wasn't until the 1960s that interest in the ship was revived over this side of the Atlantic. Now, this dapper-looking gentleman is Ewan Corlett, who was a very prominent architect, a maritime architect at the time, who wrote to the London Times in 1967, pointing out what a tragedy it was that this ship was being left to rot on the other side of the world, and surely something should be done to establish whether she was salvageable. And the Admiralty responded very favourably to this, carried out a detailed survey, and concluded that a salvage was possible, but it was going to be hugely expensive. And this is where one of your local heroes comes into the story. I can't believe, living this close to Wolverhampton, that you don't recognise this chap. Sir Jack Hayward, Union Jack, as he was often called, a passionate believer in all things British, and he basically stumped up a huge sum of money. By the way, Sir Jack died last autumn, very sadly. But he basically paid a combined German-English salvage team to take the world's largest submersible pontoon down to the Falklands early in 1970. When they got there, they set about removing the 3 remaining masts, so that the centre of gravity was kinder for when they refloated the ship. And then they had to set about doing something about this. Now, this was a real issue. You can probably just about make out a dark rectangle at the top of the hull there. Now, this is big ships on the starboard side, and that was a hatchway that the islanders had cut to make loading and unloading coal easier. And after scuttling, that proved to be a weak point, and this crack developed that split the ship right the way down to her keel. And at the time of the survey, the crack had opened up to about 18 inches wide, but more worryingly, there'd been a vertical shift as well. And they realised that unless they did something about that crack, any attempt to refloat her would almost certainly result in the ship breaking her back. And so they adopted an approach that basically predates Trafalgar. Lord Strathcona, who led the project, went on the Falkland Island radio and asked the islanders whether they had any old bedding mattresses they might have finished with. Now, given the fact Port Stanley doesn't exactly have millions living in it, unbelievably they had nearly 100 bedding mattresses given to them. I don't know what they slept on afterwards, but the idea was that these were then cut up into strips, and divers jammed them into the crack as part of a flexible watertight seal. They used other materials as well to seal the crack, but those were absolutely vital in providing that watertight seal for when the ship was refloated. And they then set about refloating her. They pumped the water out the hull, and she came afloat for the first time in over 30 years. And on that colour slide, you can clearly see the pine cladding on the top sides. Now, by now, the submersible pontoon is under the water. The only part of the pontoon you can see are these guide poles which show the position she was lying in. And the Great Britain was towed above the pontoon. Air was then pumped back into the pontoon's tanks, so it rose slowly back to the surface, and the Great Britain was made secure to the top of the pontoon and made ready for the 8,000-mile tow back across the Atlantic. And having stopped off at Montevideo in Uruguay to pick up supplies, they set out across the Atlantic. This is April 1970, And as you'll know, the Atlantic can throw anything at you at that time of year. It can be quite a volatile environment. But they were relatively lucky. They had a pretty smooth crossing, as these plates suggest. There she is coming across. The barriers towed her all the way to the Severn Estuary. The other side, almost like a mill pond at times. And they made it across to Avonmouth in just 49 days. And here she is coming into Avonmouth, still on her pontoon, and she went into the dock system at Avonmouth, where she had to be sufficiently watertight to come off the pontoon. So further works were carried out to the hull, and she was made ready to come back up the river on her own bottom. I must ask, because I ask this everywhere, did anyone see her come back? There's always at least one. I am so jealous. Did they? Yes. Fantastic. Well, it's always something I always ask, and I go all over the country, and there's always at least one. It's a bit like saying to people say they were at Woodstock. There's about 3 times as many people that were there, but I'm sure you're absolutely right. Of course you were there. And it was a grand occasion. People did turn out in their thousands, because she was ready to come back up the river on the early morning tide of Sunday, July the 5th, 1970. I'm told that about 100,000 people lined the river. I speak to a lot of visitors down at the ship who were there that day, and there were a lot of mutterings when they saw the state she was in. Are they bringing that rusty old thing back? We don't want that littering up our harbour. But of course, she came back up the river and passed under Brunel's Clifton Suspension Bridge for the one and only time in her history, because it hadn't been built when she left. And I'm told there were people up on the bridge who were dropping rose petals down on her as she came underneath. And here she is approaching the new north entrance lock with the dock system. The south entrance lock that had caused all the trouble when she left is off the picture to the right here. She came through the new north entrance lock. Here she is coming through. Again, you can see the climb very clearly. And having come through the system, she was then moored up on the far side of the harbour. She couldn't go straight into her dock. The reason being that you may well be aware that the Bristol Harbour is a floating harbour that's continually topped up by a feeder canal. But the height of the water is subject to a slight rise and fall in tide. And they knew that it had to be at a particular height if the keel of the ship was to clear the sill of the dock on her way back in. So they just put a yellow chalk mark on the side wall of the dock and waited. Now, bearing in mind she came up the river on July the 5th, this is amazing, and it wasn't by design, this is pure fluke. Brunel's first ship, the Great Western, had been launched in Bristol on July the 19th, 1837. The keel of the Great Britain was laid in her dock on July the 19th, 1839. She'd been floated out of that dock when the woman missed her with a bottle. That was July the 19th, 1843. And the tide was just right on the evening of Sunday, July the 19th, 1970, exactly 127 years after her launch, for her to be slowly towed back up the harbour into position so that she could go stern first back into the very dock in which she'd been built. And here she is coming back in. You can see a line to the starboard stern there to a tractor. There was one over on the port side as well. They pulled her in, and I'm told that the keel cleared the sill of the dock by just 7 inches, and they got her in and shut the gates just 20 minutes before the water level started to drop. They must have breathed a huge sigh of relief. And it's said the ship actually did. I've read somewhere that as the dock manager supervised the draining of the dock, he says that as the ship started to take its, the supports and blocks started to take the weight of the ship and she started to settle, she gave out this enormous groan. And then there was silence. It was almost as if the ship was saying, "Oh, thank goodness that's over. Now leave me alone." But she was back safe and sound, and those of you who have visited will know that since her return, in the 45 years since, an enormous amount has been achieved. This is the state of the bow soon after her return, and there it is today. And you're probably see that it looks like it's back afloat, and I'll tell you why that is in a minute. The top deck is in a terrible state. There's the Duke of Edinburgh coming up one of the companionways. Great supporter of the project. He insisted on coming back up the river on it in 1970, despite having broken his arm in a polo accident the previous day. So he had his arm in a sling. But you can see the state of the top deck there, and there it is today. Inside, remember, completely gutted, no passenger accommodation, no engines, so she really was just an empty hull. And inside, we've now put the first class promenade deck from the transatlantic days. So this is the 1840s section of the ship, and this is where the passengers, the first class passengers, would have been able to promenade if conditions outside prevented them from going out in fresh air. And it's down the end there that we have our frequent weddings. In fact, I was married down the end there. And it makes for a fantastic occasion on the ship. The stern was in a pretty poor state. What's missing? No propeller. Just remember, she'd been converted to a windjammer in her latter days. And the stern now looks like this, looking fabulous when she's lit from below, and the beautiful gold work around the stern ports and so on. But, and this is a but with about 6 capital B's. You might recall that the top sides have been clad in pine. Now, all the trust had to do was strip that pine off and, using high pressure water jets, wash off all the salts and then apply several layers of specialised paint, and they were in pretty good nick. But below the waterline, where those iron plates had been exposed to the salt water for over 30 years, once she was back in her dry dock, it became evident that the salt contamination was so acute that the salts were just soaking up the moisture around the dock, which was just open to the elements at the time, and she was just being eaten alive. And for many, many years, the Trust just did not know what to do. They couldn't paint or coat the hull with anything, because that would just trap the problem inside the plates, and she'd be eaten from within. And by the mid-90s, the Trust were told that unless you found an answer within about 10 or 15 years, the hull is going to become so fragile that she's probably going to have to be broken up. And so at that point, Cardiff University and some professional conservators were commissioned to look into ways of preserving the lower hull. And they came across a dehumidification system, which at the time was in use in an aspirin factory in Scandinavia. And some bright spark just had one of those light bulb moments where they thought, well, of course, if there was some way that we could control the humidity around the lower sides, cap it at 20%, the salts will no longer be active, problem solved. And we got a huge injection of lottery money round about the turn of the millennium, which enabled the Trust to cap the dock with the glass plates that you can see there. There's a small amount of water on the top, so it does look like she's back afloat, if you've got a good imagination. But apart from looking wonderful, it's working brilliantly.